Evelyn Waugh's novel Brideshead Revisited was published in the year 1945. In Brideshead Revisited, Charles Ryder is a middle-aged captain in the British Army during World War II, stationed in the Scottish countryside in 1942. He organizes his troops to move them to another location via train overnight. When the sun comes up, he realizes that the new encampment is in England near a mansion whose owners he once knew. In 1923, Charles is at Oxford studying history, and in his third term, he meets fellow student Sebastian Flyte, the son of a wealthy Catholic family, who carries around a stuffed bear named Al. Sebastian asks Charles to lunch with his friends who are witty and worldly. Sebastian later takes Charles on a day trip to the countryside where they have a picnic. On this excursion, Sebastian brings Charles to his family's home, a mansion named Brideshead. Charles is very impressed with Sebastian. The following year, after Charles has been associating with Sebastian and his friends for a while, Charles's cousin Jasper scolds him for hanging around with a bad set of people. Charles is not swayed. Anthony Blank invites Charles to dinner, where Anthony discusses in great detail the members of Sebastian's family and their peculiarities. Charles travels to London to spend the summer vacation with his father. Their time together is uncomfortable, and Charles refers to it as a war. Sebastian sends Charles a telegram stating that he is gravely injured and that Charles must come to his aid at once. When Charles arrives at Brideshead, he discovers that Sebastian has merely cracked a small bone in his foot. Charles meets Julia, Sebastian's sister. Charles spends the rest of the summer break with Sebastian and later recalls having a wonderful time. They stay at the Brideshead mansion, where Charles begins to paint a mural in one of the rooms. He meets Cordelia, Sebastian's youngest sister, and his brother Brideshead. The issue of the family's Catholicism comes up in conversations a number of times. The two friends also travel to Venice, Italy, to visit Sebastian's father, Lord Marchmain, and his mistress, Cara. Charles and Sebastian return to Oxford in the fall, where they discover that Anthony Blank has failed his classes and has moved to Munich. The two friends begin to feel older and less like pursuing their frivolous lifestyle of the previous year, and Sebastian puts away his stuffed bear. Charles begins to take art classes. Rex Mottram, Julia's boyfriend, invites them to a party in London, and they end up at a whorehouse. Later that evening, the police stop Sebastian while he is driving drunk, and everyone, including Charles, is sent to the jail. Rex bails them out. Charles goes to Brideshead Mansion for the Christmas holidays, and Lady Marchmain talks to him about becoming a Catholic. Sebastian is drinking even more heavily and is worried that Charles is watching this behavior at his mother's request. There is an ugly scene at Brideshead Mansion during the Easter break in which Sebastian is drunk and then leaves. There is another drunken scene at school later. Sebastian fails his classes at Oxford, and Lady Marchmain warns him that she will send him to live with an old priest if he does not straighten up. Sebastian goes to Venice to be with his father instead, and Lady Marchmain plans to have Mr. Samgrass, a history tutor, watch over him and take him on a vacation to the Middle East when he returns from Italy. Charles tells his father that he wants to leave Oxford to attend art school. Charles does in fact go to Paris to attend art school. Sebastian and Mr. Samgrass return from their trip. Charles comes to Brideshead Mansion for Christmas and sees that Sebastian is drinking even more and looks ill. Everyone discovers that Sebastian left Mr. Samgrass during the trip and wandered about on his own for a time. Sebastian was found only after he couldn't pay his hotel bill, and the hotel management called his family. The whole family is on edge about Sebastian's depression and drinking, but he agrees to go on a hunt, which encourages Lady Marchmain. They make sure he has no money so he cannot stop and get a drink at a pub, but Charles gives him money in secret. Sebastian is found later that day at a pub, drunk. Lady Marchmain finds out and is very angry with Charles. Rex attempts to take Sebastian to a doctor he knows in Zurich who can help him with his alcoholism, but Sebastian gives him the slip and disappears. Rex visits Charles looking for Sebastian. Charles and Rex go out to dinner where Rex tells Charles of Lady Marchmain's illness and Flight family's money troubles. Rex and Julia get married in a small ceremony. Sebastian is not present there. Charles recalls the story of Rex and Julia, and when Julia was a debutante, how she and Rex met, their courtship, and the problems with their engagement and marriage ceremony. Lady Marchmain believes that Rex is beneath Julia and demands that their engagement remain a secret, although their news gets out. Rex wants a very fancy wedding with important guests and at an important cathedral. But because he is not Catholic, this is not possible. He takes classes with the priest to become a Catholic, but he is not terribly bright. The Catholic wedding is eventually called off because Julia's brother, Brideshead, discovers that Rex has been divorced. The wedding finally takes place at a Protestant church known for marrying couples in Rex and Julia's situation. The spring of 1926 sees Charles leaving Paris for London because he feels he must be in his country of birth during its difficult economic times. The general strike occurs and Charles signs up to help distribute food. One evening, he goes to a jazz bar and runs into Anthony Blanque, who reports having allowed Sebastian to stay with him in Marseilles. He says that Sebastian was still drinking heavily and was stealing things from him to sell and pawn. Julia asks Charles to come to see Lady Marchmain at the family's London house as she is dying. Charles does so, then goes to Morocco to find Sebastian, as Lady Marchmain has asked to see him one last time before she dies. He finds Sebastian in a hospital in Fez, very ill from his drinking. He is with a German named Kurt, who is also ill. Sebastian cannot travel to England because of his poor health, so Charles stays for a week and helps him settle his financial affairs. Charles returns to England and agrees to paint 4 oils of the soon to be torn down Marchmain House in London, as requested by Brideshead. Lady Marchmain dies. Cordelia later tells Charles that Lady Marchmain's funeral mass was the last event at the family chapel at Brideshead before it was closed up. The story now moves to the late 1930s when Charles is a painter of some repute, primarily of buildings about to be razed. He is married to Celia, the sister of fellow Oxford student, and they have 2 young children. He is returning from a 2-year trip to Mexico and Central America, where he was drawing ruins. He meets Celia in New York City and they leave for London on a ship. They seem to have a cool relationship, although Celia is a very friendly woman who loves to entertain. They give a cocktail party on board the ship the first night and also discover that Julia is on board. A storm hits the ship and Celia retires seasick to her room throughout the storm's duration, about 3 days. Charles and Julia gets reacquainted during this time and they eventually make love in Julia's stateroom. Charles recalls that Celia once had an affair and Julia tells Charles of her failed marriage with Rex and of her stillborn daughter. Charles sends Celia to their home while he stays in London to set up his new art show and to see Julia. Charles and Julia continue their affair in London and his art show is a success. There is talk of war at the show. Anthony Blanc appears at the show's opening and he and Charles go to a bar to talk about old times. He knows that Julia and Charles's affair, having heard people speak of it at a luncheon that day. Charles and Julia have been together for 2 years but haven't sought divorces from their spouses. They are now at Brideshead, as is Rex. One evening, Brideshead arrives from London with the sudden news that he is getting married to Beryl Muspratt, a widow with 3 children. He also mentions that his fiancée probably will not come to Brideshead to see Charles and Julia, as she is a very proper Catholic woman and would disapprove of their living arrangements. He also expects that Julia and Rex and Charles will leave the mansion to make room for his new family. This greatly upsets Julia, and she begins to question whether she is a sinner in the eyes of her God. Rex arrives with his political friends, and there is more talk of war. Both Charles and Julia begin the process of divorcing their spouses. Rex gives patriotic speeches in the House of Commons, and the country is full of the talk of avoiding war with the Germans. Cordelia shows up at Brideshead after years as a nurse and aid worker in Spain. She has seen Sebastian. He is living in Tunis, still drinking heavily and ill but living at a monastery. Brideshead marries Beryl. Given the increasing political tensions in Europe, Lord Marchmain decides to return to England and the Brideshead mansion with his mistress in the winter. He arrives seriously ill. Julia and Charles, who had moved out of Brideshead, move back to the mansion to be with Lord Marchmain. He tells Julia and Charles that he dislikes Brideshead's new wife, Beryl, and cannot imagine her as the lady of the manor after he dies. He says he is seriously considering leaving the estate to Julia and Charles, which stuns them. By Easter, Lord Marchmain is getting sicker and closer to death, and Brideshead demands that a priest be sent for. The priest comes, but Lord Marchmain sends him away because he is a non practicing Catholic. Charles is very disdainful of Brideshead's bringing in the priest. In June, Charles and Celia's divorce is final, and she marries again. In July, Lord Marchmain is unconscious, and Julia brings back the priest. Charles disagrees with this, but is not surprised at her actions. He has seen her becoming more religious during the summer. The priest arrives, gives Marchmain the final blessing, and he responds when the priest asks him if he is sorry for his sins. This apparent sign that Lord Marchmain has accepted Catholicism again overwhelms Charles, who kneels and says a short prayer. Julia decides that she can no longer be with Charles in what she now sees as a sinful relationship. The story ends where it began, with Charles as a captain in the British Army, encamped near the Brideshead mansion during World War II. Julia, who is overseas with Cordelia helping with the war effort, now owns the mansion. Brideshead is serving with the British cavalry in Palestine. Charles wanders around the old place, reminiscing, and bumps into a few of the staff still there. The family chapel is open, with a light burning upon the altar. Charles says a short prayer and leaves.